Bibles, if you would turn to Matthew, the 7th chapter, Matthew chapter 7, and verse 14. Matthew 7 and verse 14, the text says, "For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." Now there's two very hard truths that are set forth in this verse. Number one, the gate's narrow and the way to spiritual life is hard. That's a difficult lesson that we have to learn. It's not an easy path. It's not a broad path. There is nothing simple about succeeding in finding spiritual life. And the second lesson is that those who find spiritual life are few. And that's kind of discouraging if you think about it. It depends on how you want to look at this. I don't really know how to approach it, but I'll just say it like this. There are a lot of people. There are a lot of people who give lip service to God. There are a lot of people who give lip service to religion. And I tend to think that many of them are sincere. I think that they are unaware, unstudied, that they are not dedicated to the pursuit of the knowledge of God on their own, that they don't test the things that are taught to them and look up. So as a result of that, they are led astray. And I think that they're sincere people who just don't know any better than what they're doing, and they believe that what they're doing is okay. Matthew 7 talks about those people who are going to be confronted on that day, and they're going to say, "We did many things in your name." And the Lord's going to say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." So there's a lot of folks who think that they're walking down the path, but what Matthew 7:14 says is it's a very difficult way, and there's going to be few people who actually navigate that path. So why should we work so hard to find it? That's the question that I think needs to be asked when you realize just how hard it is and just how few there are who are going to find it. Is it worth that much effort? We need to remember that some folks that were disciples of Jesus departed from him because they found his teachings too difficult. An example of that is John chapter 6. In John chapter 6 in verse 60 it says, "When many of his disciples heard it," this is some teaching that he had just offered, "when many of his disciples heard it, they said, 'This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?'" But the text doesn't stop there. Down in verse 66 it says, "After this many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him." And so when people are confronted with some of these hard truths and they realize how difficult it is, sometimes they're not willing to make the commitment and pay the price that it takes in order to get there. So why should we work so hard to find it? We want to talk about a few things, or consider a few things, three of them as a matter of fact, that I believe make it worth the effort. And I wouldn't say that they're exactly ordered in any particular order, but I will tell you that the first one is the least motivational to me. There is a very base type of motivation in this, trying to avoid something bad, but it should be the lesser of all of our motivations for why we might do something. But at any rate, we want to first consider the fact that the alternative simply isn't good. The alternative way, that broad way that leads to destruction, is not good. It's not a good end. The path itself is easy. The cost is low. There's not much that you need to do in order to traverse that path and find yourself in that place, but it's not a good place. Hell is not going to be an eternal hedonistic party. And this is where I want us to really think about this for a moment. I think that's the way many people think about hell, is that there's just going to be no holds barred, whatever you want to do, hedonism for eternity. But that is not the picture of hell that's set forth in the Scriptures. Mark chapter 9 and verse 43 and following says this, "If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off." That's pretty drastic. That's actually another one of those hard things to listen to. Now, he isn't actually encouraging damaging our body and being harmful to our bodies. This is figure of speech that is just highlighting how serious sin is. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life crippled than with 2 hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. He goes on to say, and if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And so he goes through this series of things, and he says, essentially, whatever part of you is causing you to sin, it's better to not have that part of you at all than to end up where that sin is going to bring you. And that just highlights or underscores how bad eternal destruction is. This language at the end, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, this is more very graphic language about the nature of hell. When a body dies and is put into the ground, there are creatures that consume the body. And when the body is gone, those creatures go away. And so the language here where the worm does not die is intended to make you realize that that process doesn't stop. The eternal process of destruction doesn't end. There's not going to be a consumption and then it stops. It's just going to continue going. The fire is not quenched. I've been burned a couple of times in my life, rather severely, and it's very uncomfortable and it hurts really, really bad, but eventually the pain goes away. Eventually the fire is quenched and the pain subsides, and you get some relief until somebody touches it or you rub it against something, and then it all fires up again for just a little while, and then the pain subsides yet again. But in this case, he said the fire is not quenched. The circumstances of eternal destruction don't let up, and they don't stop. So the alternative is not a good alternative. Hell will be the destination for those who refuse to walk the way that leads to life. If you look at Matthew 25, verses 31 through 34, it says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he'll sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from goats. And he'll place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, come, you are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. But notice down in verse 41, he'll say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. There's this great separation that's going to take place. And everyone is going to find themselves either on the side of being received by the Lord into the glories of heaven, or cast out into eternal destruction. That's the only options that we have. This is a true dichotomy. There's not going to be anyone who escapes eternity. The only question is what eternity is going to be for us. So however difficult it is to walk the way that leads to life, the teaching of Jesus is it's worth the effort. Even if you have to make sacrifices to get there. To the extent that he suggests that even if it means sacrificing a hand or a foot or an eye, it will still be worth it in the end. And so that's the first thing I'd suggest to you, is that the alternative of walking that difficult path that leads to life may be easier now, but the eventual price and end is much higher. Number 2, spiritual life is far better than your physical life. And this is important because for most people, and by the way, I think that this is true for a lot of Christians as well, not just people who don't identify as Christians or people who are anti-religion, but I think this happens for most Christians as well too. Physical life, because we're in the middle of it and we're experiencing it and we feel it and we enjoy parts of it, and physical life becomes really important to us. Too much so if we're not careful. Our earthly relationships should in fact bring us joy. I believe that completely. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 18 and 19, let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. This idea of joy and blessedness and delight and intoxication in love, these are all good things. And these relationships are intended to serve us and to be good for us. The psalmist in Psalm 127 in verse 3 through 5 says this about children. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of a womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. So our spouses are a blessing. Our children are a blessing. Our family is a blessing. Many things in this life are a blessing. They're greatly enjoyable. The memories that we have of life are enjoyable. As most of you know, this is a time of reflection for my family. My brother spent a good part of yesterday, apparently, putting together the memorial film that will be playing at the service at the end of the week, and I was reviewing part of it this afternoon with the few minutes that I had. I didn't get very far into it, and I got to review it all. But just the photographs that were used in it back from my childhood brought up all kind of great memories of things that we did together and places that we went together and time that we spent together, and brought back a sense of joy and a sense of pleasure. That's exactly the way it ought to be. Creation is wonderful. We spend a lot of time in my family going to the mountains. And to behold the mountains is just wonderful. It's beautiful to see. It's beautiful to see the sunrise. It's beautiful to see the sunset. Some people love the ocean. There are some strange people that love the desert. To each their own. Creation is wonderful. The Proverbs in chapter 8, verses 27 through 31. We have wisdom personified here. Wisdom is speaking to us and instructing us. And it says, when he established the heavens, I was there. Wisdom was there. When God established these things, wisdom was there. When he drew a circle on the fence of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of men. And so wisdom says, I watched God do all of these things, found all of these things, create all of these things, and then I watched. And I rejoiced in the inhabited world. I took delight in the children of men. Our fellow men should be delightful to us. They don't always act that way. But we tend to, when we step back and as we reflect back upon things, we tend to at least remember the good things. And things tend to take a brighter light as we look at them, and we enjoy and delight in life. But what the Bible teaches is that spiritual life is much better than anything that you'll experience on this earth. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 18, it looks about our existence in time from the negative to begin with, the suffering that we experience in this life. But it says, I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And the suffering he has in mind is the difficulty that we have to go through in order to attain the life at the end of that narrow way. That suffering that comes upon us because we are making the choice to go down through that narrow gate and that difficult path that leads to life. He says that whatever that suffering is, the sufferings of this present time isn't worth being compared to the glory that will be revealed. In other words, it's incomparable. Spiritual life, eternal life, is so much greater than anything that we experience in our physical existence. It's simply not worthy to be compared. And that's why this is true. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. The reason that it's true that we shouldn't build up for ourselves treasures in this life is because the things of this life are perishable. They're temporary. The new shiny car becomes the old beater. The new home but becomes run down after time. Everything we experience in life will, our young lives, our vitality, our strength, our power, the acumen of our mind, the clarity of our thought, those things begin to wane over time as our bodies grow old, and they begin to weaken, and they begin to wrinkle, and they begin to grow weak. It begins to be hard to get up. It begins to be hard to walk. It begins to be hard to breathe. Everything begins to hurt, and then the mind can go. I've known situations where people got to the point that they didn't even know their spouse and their children. Everything connected to this earth deteriorates. It wastes away, whether it's destroyed by things like rust or moths, whether it's stolen by other untrustworthy men, whether it just decays over time. Whatever it is that we accumulate for ourselves in time, that's what happens to it. We can't bring anything with us from this world. We need to realize that all of the things that we seem to put so much time and effort into are temporal. And in realizing that, maybe we can start to put more time and effort into those things that are eternal, realizing their worth and their nature. As it was expressed one time by Brother Jack Holt, who I worked with for a time in Lindale, Texas, he told a group of people that were assembled, look, go home this afternoon and walk around your house and look at all of those photographs and look at all of those things that you treasure and take stock of all that you own and realize that none of it is important compared to your soul. None of those things can be carried with you. None of those things last beyond life. But you do. Thirdly, let's think about the imperishable nature of spiritual life. Imperishable means that it can't spoil. He says that what is reserved for us in heaven is imperishable, undefiled. That's another word that's used to describe it, which means it's not contaminated. Everything on this earth is contaminated. We contaminate it. It's imperishable, it's undefiled, and it's unfading, he says. Heaven never loses its luster. It never ceases to shine. It never ceases to be glorious. But everything connected to this life does. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 5 with me. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. And what Peter is trying to get us to, well, let me rephrase that. What God is trying to get us to see through Peter is that what is kept in store for us in heaven is so much greater, because it cannot spoil, it is not contaminated in any way, and it will never lose its luster. The earth is none of these things. The earth is spoiled. It's contaminated. It loses its luster, and it will come to an end. Look in Genesis chapter 3 with me. Genesis 3, verses 17, 18, and 19. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Listen to this. Cursed is the ground because of you. See, the very ground is defiled. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. You shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The ground is defiled, and we are taken from the ground, so we are defiled. Our bodies, they're temporary. And inspired Peter speaks of the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. Corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. That's corruption that you and I bring into the world. Our desires introduce this corruption. So we've got this cursedness and this corruption. Look with me, if you will, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. He also says here, the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved. Speaking of the bodies of the outer space, the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved. All what things? Well, the things he just named. The heavenly bodies, the earth, the works that are done on it. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in the lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. And so it is that this world is perishable, and this world is limited, and this world is corrupted, and this world is ending, and this world is going to be dissolved, melted, and burned. And so this creates a real conundrum for the faithful and for the informed. Look with me closely at Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, we want to first look at verses 12 and 13. As we see this conundrum identified for those of us that are informed, those of us who know and understand this distinction between the earthly and the spiritual, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And so understand what's going on here. Paul, who is writing this letter by inspiration, has been thrown in jail for preaching the gospel. He's been thrown in jail, and as he looks at this, he says, my imprisonment, it turns out to be, is for Christ. Because I've been able to advance the gospel through this endeavor. Now look down at verse 22. Here's where we're going to see the conundrum that really ought to exist within the heart of each and every faithful and informed individual. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. So not only has Paul been imprisoned for preaching the gospel, but he realized that his life is on the stake. He knows that he is going to be condemned and that the end of that condemnation is likely to be his execution. And he is facing that reality, and he's asking the question, is it worth it? Was it worth it? Was it worth it for me to do what I did? Was it worth it for me to teach what I taught and become imprisoned? And he said, look, as it turns out, my imprisonment has advanced the cause of Christ even further than had I not been arrested. And so, yes, it's worth it. And when it comes to my life, he says, I'm hard-pressed to decide whether or not I wish I would live or whether I'm okay with them putting me to death. I realize that if I continue to live, then I can do fruitful work. I can teach people, and I can change lives, and I can help people find their way to that path that leads to life and find life in Christ. And that's great, and that's a great thing for me, and it's a great thing for others. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. But which I shall choose, I cannot tell. Now, this isn't suggesting that Paul is suicidal. This isn't suggesting that Paul even has a pick in what happens. He's saying which I think is a better outcome. I'm not sure of. While I know that there's good things that I could continue doing in the service of God if I live on in the flesh, I know something else. I know that if I depart this world, I'm going to be with Christ, and that's very much better. You see, he understood that what's in store on the other side of life is imperishable, that it's undefiled, that it won't fade away, that rust don't destroy it, that moths don't eat it, that it never. He knew what was in store for him was better because of the life that he lived. You'll recall that he said that he had kept the faith, and in the future there was reserved for him crown of glory in heaven. He had done what he needed to do to walk that difficult path that leads to life. He was convinced and he trusted God to do what God had promised. And despite the fact that his life was filled with hardship and difficulty, that he had been shipwrecked in his efforts to teach the gospel, that he had been captured and imprisoned and beaten, threatened his life, despite all of those hardships, despite the fact that he had given up a promising career back in Jerusalem as a Pharisee that studied at the feet of Gamaliel, who was head and shoulders above his peers in respect and honor. He was a man that more than likely would have ended up on the Sanhedrin Council. A powerful political figure in the nation of Israel. And he gave all that up, he said, and counted it as but rubbish for the surpassing greatness of Christ, of knowing the Lord. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that's far better. He understood. He understood how valuable. I'm here striving to learn righteousness because I want to go to heaven. And it's hard. And I read some of the things that I read in the Bible, and I say, wait a minute. If that's the way it is, then who can stand to listen to this? I'm just like those folks in John 6. At times, I'm just like the rich young ruler, where I'm confronted with something that I love, and I'm told that it's something that I should give up. And it's hard for me to give it up. But I try, and I strive, and I fight with myself, because I want to go to heaven, and I trust that's why you're here tonight too. I trust that's why there's people who are not here tonight who are streaming this on Facebook or on YouTube. I trust that's why people will watch the videos later. That's why people watch videos from other places like us. That's why people go to Bible studies. That's why people speak to their neighbors. That's why people fight against their impulses and their desires and struggle with themselves. Let's be honest, there are other things that we could be doing. But this is very much better because this is connected to those things that endure. This is connected to the imperishable. This is connected to the treasures in heaven. This is part of the difficult path that leads to life. And it's the kind of life that's required if I'm to be part of the few who find life. I want us to go to heaven because hell is not good. I also want us to go to heaven because it's very much better to be in heaven than it is even to live this physical life. And unlike this physical life, which has its good moments, and then those good moments kind of fade over time, its glory is unending. I don't even have the capacity. I don't have the capacity to truly conceptualize a place where, and there's not going to be time there, so excuse me for using accommodative language, where 1,000 years from now, where 10,000 years from now, when 100,000 years from now, I'm still discovering the glory of being there. It's still new and exciting and shiny and beautiful and undefiled. Nothing I've ever experienced in life is like that. Everything becomes old. Everything becomes boring. Everything becomes worn out. Everything quits working. Everything comes to an end. But in heaven, the glory is unending. It just keeps getting better and better and better and better. I don't know what it's going to be like to be with God in heaven. But I know it's very much better than life. And I know that it's very much better than anything that I could provide for myself. And I certainly know it's very much better than the only alternative that God has given me. So we need to realize the value of the work that we have been given to do. And we need to appreciate what comes to us on the other side of the struggle. And keep fighting. Or as they used to say in the 70s, keep on keeping on. Not give up, not grow weary in well-doing, for in due time you will reap if you do not grow weary.